The night is thick over the Caribbean. Somewhere below a black ocean, a runway cuts through the palm trees of a tiny island most maps forgot to name. No country owns it. No law reaches it. A plane without lights descends out of the dark, its cargo hold packed with white powder that will turn a farm boy from the mountains of Colombia into one of the richest, most dangerous men alive, and then destroy him just as completely. This is the story of a man who did not just sell cocaine. He built an empire out of it, bought his own kingdom, crowned himself its king, and watched it all burn to ash around him while the world watched. This is the story of Carlos Lehder, the man who turned an island into a runway, and turned a runway into the gateway for an entire nation's descent into blood and money. Before we go further into the shadows, tell me, where are you watching this from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments below. I want to know who's out there in the dark with me, listening to this story unfold. Every empire built on blood begins somewhere quiet. Somewhere ordinary. And the story of Carlos Lehder begins not in a jungle laboratory or a smoke-filled boardroom of criminals, but in a modest home in the coffee country of Colombia, in a town called Armenia, in the department of Quindío, in the year 1949. The world into which Carlos Enrique Lehder Rivas was born gave no hint of the storm that would one day carry his name across 2 continents. His father was a German immigrant, a hard-working, disciplined man who had come to Colombia seeking opportunity and stability in a country still finding its feet after decades of political violence. His mother was Colombian, and from her, Carlos would inherit the fire, the charisma, and the restless hunger that would define every chapter of his life to come. It was a household caught between 2 worlds, European order on one side, Latin American passion on the other, and perhaps it was this tension, this pull between discipline and chaos, that shaped the man who would grow up straddling both, and ultimately mastering neither. Quindío in the 1950s was not the Colombia the world would later come to fear. It was coffee country, rolling green hills stitched together by narrow roads, small towns where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest scandal of the week might be a stolen chicken or a drunken brawl outside the cantina. Colombia itself, however, was a nation already bleeding. The period known as La Violencia, a brutal, decade-long civil conflict between liberals and conservatives, had left hundreds of thousands dead across the countryside, and though Quindío was somewhat insulated from the worst of the fighting, the scars of a nation accustomed to bloodshed were everywhere, in the stories told by adults in hushed voices, in the fear that lingered just beneath the surface of ordinary life. Young Carlos grew up in a country that had already learned, generation after generation, that violence was simply a tool, one that men reached for when law and order failed to give them what they wanted. It was a lesson that would settle deep into his bones long before he ever touched a kilo of cocaine. By most accounts, Carlos was a restless, sharp-witted child, intelligent in the way that unsettles teachers because it refuses to sit quietly inside a classroom. He was curious about machines, about money, about the world beyond the hills of Quindío. Colombia in those years was a country of immense natural beauty and equally immense inequality, a small elite controlling vast wealth while millions scraped by on subsistence farming, and for a boy who was watching, who was absorbing every signal the world gave him about where power and money actually lived, the lesson was not subtle. Hard work on a coffee farm might feed a family, but it would never build an empire. And somewhere inside young Carlos, even before he understood what he wanted, he understood that he wanted more. His parents eventually divorced, a rupture that, in the conservative, Catholic Colombia of that era, was neither common nor easily forgiven by a small town's watching eyes. It's difficult to say with certainty how deeply this affected the boy, because the private wounds of childhood rarely make it cleanly into the historical record. But those who study men like Lehder, men who grow up to build empires out of chaos, often find, somewhere in the early years, a fracture. A moment where the world proved itself unstable, untrustworthy, a stage on which even the people who were supposed to be permanent could disappear. Whatever the cause, young Carlos developed early a trait that would follow him for the rest of his life. He trusted almost no one completely, and he believed, with an intensity that bordered on obsession, that the world rewarded those who took what they wanted rather than waited to be given it. As a teenager, Carlos left Colombia for the United States, following a path that thousands of young Latin Americans took in that era, chasing the promise of American opportunity. He landed in New York, and later would spend time around Detroit and Miami, cities that, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, were pulsing with a very different kind of energy than the quiet coffee hills of Quindío. This was America in the shadow of the counterculture, an America where marijuana smoke drifted through college dorms and city apartments, where an entire generation was rebelling against the rigid expectations of their parents, and where an underground economy of drugs was quietly, steadily, expanding into something far larger than anyone in law enforcement had yet grasped. For a young man like Carlos, hungry, quick-thinking, unafraid of risk, and utterly uninterested in a life of quiet obedience, this world was not a temptation to resist. It was an education waiting to happen. It was in this environment that Carlos began to build the skills that would later make him infamous, not the skills of violence, not yet, but the skills of logistics. He learned to move things. Small amounts of marijuana at first, then larger amounts, transported across state lines in cars, hidden in compartments, sold to a growing network of buyers who wanted what he could supply. He was, even then, thinking less like a street dealer and more like a businessman, someone who saw the drug trade not as a series of individual transactions but as a system, a supply chain, something that could be optimized, scaled, made efficient. This distinction may sound small, but it would prove to be the difference between the thousands of small-time dealers who cycled through American jails in the 1970s and the handful of men, Lehder among them, who would go on to reshape the entire global drug trade. But ambition without caution is a dangerous combination, and it did not take long for Carlos's growing operation to attract the attention of American law enforcement. In the early 1970s, he was arrested, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, on charges related to the transportation of marijuana and, according to some accounts, stolen vehicles that were part of his logistics network. He served time in an American prison, a period of his life that, on the surface, might seem like a footnote, a minor setback in the career of a small-time smuggler. But it was anything but minor. It was, in fact, the single most important turning point in the entire story of Carlos Lehder, because it was in that prison that he met the man who would change the direction of his ambition forever, a convicted car thief and small-time criminal named George Jung. George Jung, a name that would later become almost as infamous as Lehder's own, immortalized decades later in film and legend, was, at the time they met, simply another inmate serving time for a marijuana-related offense. But Jung had connections. He had spent time in California, had contacts among the marijuana smugglers moving product up from Mexico and further south, and he had an appetite for risk that matched Lehder's own. The two men, thrown together by the strange intimacy of incarceration, the shared boredom, the shared resentment of a system that had caged them, the long hours with nothing to do but talk and plan, began to dream together. And what they dreamed about was not marijuana. Marijuana was bulky, low value per pound, difficult to move in large quantities without detection. What they dreamed about was a different substance entirely, one that was, at that point in the mid-1970s, still a niche product in the United States, expensive, glamorous, associated with the wealthy and the famous. Cocaine. It's worth pausing here to understand just how different the cocaine trade looked in the mid-1970s compared to what it would become just a few years later. Cocaine at that time was not the epidemic-level scourge it would become in the 1980s. It was a boutique product, smuggled in relatively small quantities, often by individual couriers, mules, carrying a few kilograms at a time in suitcases or strapped to their bodies. The supply lines ran up from Colombia and Peru and Bolivia, where coca had been cultivated for centuries, through intermediaries, into the hands of a small number of American distributors who sold it at astronomical markups to a clientele of musicians, actors, Wall Street traders, and the fashionable elite of cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Miami. It was, in short, an artisan trade, profitable, but limited by the sheer inefficiency of its supply chain. And it was precisely this inefficiency that Carlos Lehder, sitting in a prison cell, talking with George Jung, identified as an opportunity so vast it was almost impossible to comprehend. Lehder's genius, and it is important to call it that, however dark the purpose to which it was applied, was not that he discovered cocaine. It was that he saw, before almost anyone else in the criminal underworld, that the trade could be industrialized. That instead of individual mules carrying a few kilos at a time, someone could build an actual logistics network, airplanes instead of suitcases, dedicated smuggling routes instead of one-off trips, a supply chain that treated cocaine not as a boutique luxury item but as a mass-market commodity to be produced, transported, and distributed at a scale that dwarfed anything that had come before. It was the same instinct that had made him valuable as a marijuana smuggler, but now applied to a product with a profit margin so enormous that even modest success would make him staggeringly wealthy. Where others in the criminal world thought in terms of the next shipment, the next sale, the next quick score, Lehder was already thinking in terms of infrastructure. He was thinking like the founder of an industry, not a criminal chasing a payday. When Lehder was released from American prison, his sentence complete, his ambitions now crystallized into something far larger and darker than the marijuana smuggling that had first landed him behind bars. He returned to Colombia a changed man. He was no longer simply a hustler looking for the next opportunity. He had a vision. He understood the American appetite for cocaine was about to explode, driven by a booming economy, a culture increasingly obsessed with wealth, status, and hedonistic excess, and a coastal geography, Florida in particular, that was practically begging to be exploited by anyone bold enough to build the right infrastructure. And he understood something else, something that would become the signature insight of his entire criminal career: if you wanted to move enormous quantities of cocaine into the United States undetected, you didn't need a better mule. You needed a better route. You needed control, total, unchallenged control, over a piece of geography that no government, no Coast Guard, no DEA agent could touch. It was around this time that Lehder began to make contact with the men who were beginning to organize Colombia's cocaine trade into something resembling an actual criminal enterprise, men from Medellin, a city in the mountainous heart of Colombia's Antioquia department, a city of fierce local pride, industrious ambition, and, increasingly, a criminal underworld that was starting to think in terms that matched Lehder's own outsized vision. Among these men was a young, quiet, calculating former car thief and small-time kidnapper named Pablo Escobar, a name that, at this point in the mid-1970s, meant almost nothing outside a small circle of Medellin's underworld, but which would soon become synonymous with cocaine itself, with violence on a scale Colombia had never seen, with a level of wealth and power that would make him, for a time, one of the richest and most feared men on the entire planet. Lehder and Escobar were, in these early years, not yet the titans of legend they would become. They were ambitious young criminals from very different backgrounds: Lehder, worldly, half German, fluent in English, comfortable moving through American culture; Escobar, a product of Medellin slums, ruthless, patient, deeply loyal to his inner circle and utterly merciless to anyone who crossed him, circling each other, sizing each other up, beginning to understand that together their skills might complement each other in ways that could reshape the entire trade. But before the empire could be built, before the island fortress, before the billions of dollars and the private zoo and the political ambitions that would one day see Lehder try to reshape Colombian politics itself, there was a simpler, more urgent problem to solve, the same problem that had limited every cocaine smuggler who came before him. How do you get an enormous quantity of a highly illegal substance from the jungles and laboratories of Colombia into the hungry, cash-rich cities of the United States, without a customs agent, a Coast Guard cutter, or a DEA informant catching you in the act? Lehder had an answer, and it was audacious even by the standards of a man who would go on to live one of the most audacious criminal lives in modern history. He would not sneak the cocaine in through existing routes, competing with other smugglers for the same overworked, overwatched pathways. He would find, or if necessary, buy, his own private gateway. A place with no government watching. A place he could control completely, land and sky and sea. A place where the rules of nations simply did not apply, because he would be the one making the rules. Somewhere in the scattered islands of the Bahamas, in the turquoise shallows between Nassau and the Florida coast, there was a small, largely forgotten strip of land, a place most people had never heard of, a place with a tiny population, a single airstrip built decades earlier, and almost no meaningful government oversight. It was called Norman's Cay. And when Carlos Lehder first laid eyes on it, he did not see a sleepy Caribbean island. He saw the future. He saw the single most valuable piece of real estate in the entire hemisphere for a man in his line of work, a private, defensible, nearly invisible gateway sitting exactly halfway between the cocaine-producing jungles of Colombia and the cocaine-hungry cities of the United States. He saw, in other words, the foundation of a kingdom. And he understood, with the cold clarity that had marked every important decision of his life so far, that whoever controlled that island would control the artery through which an entire nation's cocaine supply could flow. What Carlos Lehder did next would transform him from a small-time smuggler with big ideas into one of the most powerful and feared criminals in the world, a man who would, for a time, control a private island fortress, amass a fortune estimated in the billions, and become so bold, so consumed by his own sense of invincibility, that he would eventually try to buy his way into Colombian politics itself, running for public office while secretly running one of the largest drug empires the world had ever seen. He would build an army of pilots and mercenaries. He would form an uneasy, blood-soaked partnership with Pablo Escobar and the men who would become known to history as the Medellin cartel. He would flood the United States with more cocaine than any single trafficker before him. And he would fall, spectacularly, violently, inevitably, betrayed by the very men he trusted most, hunted by two governments determined to make an example of him, his empire reduced to ash in a matter of years. But that story, the story of the island kingdom, of Norman's Cay transformed into a smuggler's paradise complete with private security, attack dogs, and a fleet of aircraft moving cocaine through the night sky toward Florida, that is a story for the next chapter of this dark and unforgettable descent into the underworld of Carlos Lehder, the man who did not just join the cocaine trade. He built its highway in the sky, and crowned himself king of everything that flew across it. If you've made it this far into the shadows with me, let me know, should we continue deeper into the story? I'll be writing the next part of Carlos Lehder's rise, the building of his island empire, whenever you're ready. Just say the word, and we'll keep going. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a place just before it becomes something else entirely, before the world discovers what it's about to be used for, before its name becomes a byword for excess and menace. Norman's Cay, in the years before Carlos Lehder set his eyes upon it, existed in exactly that kind of silence. It was a small island, barely more than 4 miles long and less than a mile wide, part of the Exuma chain in the Bahamas, ringed by shallow reefs and clear turquoise water, home to a scattering of vacation homes, a modest marina, and a population that numbered only in the dozens. Sailboats occasionally anchored in its harbor. A handful of wealthy Americans owned second homes there, drawn by the isolation and the beauty. It was, in short, exactly the kind of forgotten paradise that nobody in a position of authority was watching closely, and that, precisely, was its value. By the late 1970s, Lehder had already begun moving cocaine into the United States using more conventional methods, small planes, hired pilots, clandestine airstrips scattered across the Bahamas and southern Florida, but he understood, with the same instinct that had separated him from every small-time smuggler he'd ever known, that this piecemeal approach had a ceiling. Every additional flight increased the odds of exposure. Every new pilot was a potential informant. Every improvised landing strip was a liability waiting to be discovered by a Bahamian patrol boat or an American surveillance flight. If he wanted to move cocaine at the scale he was now envisioning, not kilograms, but hundreds of kilograms, then thousands, an amount that would make him one of the wealthiest criminals alive, he needed something no smuggler before him had ever truly possessed, total ownership of the ground beneath the operation. Not a rented strip. Not a bribed official. An island. His island. The acquisition of Norman's Cay did not happen in a single dramatic stroke. It happened the way empires often begin, quietly, through intermediaries, through shell companies and straw buyers, through a patient accumulation of property that, piece by piece, gave Lehder effective control of the island's only harbor, its only airstrip, and eventually, most of its inhabitable land. He is believed to have first arrived on the island in the mid-1970s, drawn by its private airstrip and its proximity to Florida, a mere 210 miles from the coast, close enough that a small aircraft loaded with cocaine could make the crossing in a matter of hours under cover of darkness. He began buying land, then buying out the marina, then systematically pressuring or paying off the island's remaining private residents to sell their homes and leave. Some accounts describe intimidation, dogs, armed men patrolling beaches that had once belonged to ordinary vacationing families, a creeping sense among the island's original inhabitants that their idyllic retreat had become something they no longer recognized and no longer controlled. Others simply left because the money offered was too good to refuse, or because the atmosphere had become one where refusal itself felt unwise. By the end of the decade, Norman's Cay had been transformed. What had once been a quiet Bahamian retreat was now, in effect, a private, heavily fortified smuggling base, the nerve center of what would become one of the most audacious drug trafficking operations in modern history. Lehder expanded and reinforced the airstrip, lengthening it to accommodate larger aircraft, including converted DC-3s capable of carrying enormous cocaine payloads in a single flight. He built radar equipment to track approaching aircraft and warn of incoming law enforcement patrols. He stationed armed guards around the island's perimeter, along with attack dogs trained to patrol the beaches and grounds at night. Speedboats capable of outrunning Bahamian Coast Guard vessels sat ready in the harbor. It was, by any reasonable definition, a private military installation, except that its purpose was not defense of a nation, but defense of a criminal enterprise so lucrative that its architect was willing to build an entire fortified kingdom to protect it. And Lehder did not stop at infrastructure. He wanted the island to reflect not just the logistics of his operation but the image of himself that he had begun, with growing intensity, to cultivate, the image of a man who was not merely a smuggler, but a kind of outlaw royalty, untouchable, magnetic, larger than life. He imported exotic animals, reportedly including monkeys that were allowed to roam parts of the island, giving Norman's Cay an almost surreal, dreamlike quality, a Caribbean paradise turned smuggler's fortress turned private menagerie, all under the control of a single man barely 30 years old. He threw lavish parties for the pilots, smugglers, and hangers-on who now called the island home or passed through it regularly, parties fueled by the very product that had built the island's fortune, an Ouroboros of excess in which the substance being smuggled to enrich its architect was also the substance used to fuel the celebrations of his growing court. Guests would later describe evenings of open cocaine use, loud music, and a strange, feverish energy, the atmosphere of men who knew, on some level, that they were living inside a bubble that could not last forever, and who had decided the only sane response was to enjoy it as intensely and recklessly as possible while it did. At the center of all of it was Lehder himself, and it is here that the historical record becomes genuinely strange, because the man who emerges from the accounts of those who knew him during the Norman's Cay years is not simply a calculating criminal executive, though he was certainly that, but something closer to an unstable, mercurial figure whose moods could swing from magnetic charm to explosive paranoia within the span of a single conversation. He was, by multiple accounts, an avid consumer of the cocaine his operation existed to distribute, and the drug's effects, the grandiosity, the paranoia, the volatility, seemed to intertwine with his own personality until it became difficult to say where the man ended and the substance began. He would speak for hours about politics, about history, about his fascination with figures like Adolf Hitler and John Lennon, an almost incomprehensible pairing that nonetheless seemed to genuinely captivate him, admiring in the former a ruthless will to power and in the latter a kind of countercultural, anti-establishment defiance that Lehder, in his own twisted way, believed he embodied. He saw himself, according to those who spent time around him in this period, not simply as a criminal but as a revolutionary of sorts, a man striking back at American imperialism by flooding its cities with the very substance its wealthy citizens craved, profiting from their hypocrisy even as he fed their addiction. This self-image, half business genius, half ideological crusader, half unhinged megalomaniac, would come to define every major decision Lehder made for the rest of his criminal career, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it separates him meaningfully from many of the other major traffickers of his era. Pablo Escobar, for all his brutality, understood himself primarily in economic and, later, political terms, a man building wealth and power for himself, his family, and eventually his standing within Colombian society. The Ochoa brothers, another powerful Medellin trafficking family who would soon become Lehder's partners, operated with the calculated caution of old money aristocrats protecting an inheritance. But Lehder operated with something closer to messianic conviction, a belief that he was not merely getting rich but making a statement, and this conviction would eventually push him toward decisions, political ambitions, provocative public statements, a growing recklessness in his personal conduct, that his more cautious partners would come to see as a liability too dangerous to tolerate. But in the late 1970s, none of that reckoning had yet arrived. What existed instead was momentum, extraordinary, accelerating, almost impossible to comprehend momentum. With Norman's case secured as a private waypoint, Lehder essentially solved the single greatest logistical problem of the international cocaine trade. Cocaine base, and later refined cocaine, would be flown from clandestine airstrips in Colombia, many of them, in these early years, connected to the operations of Pablo Escobar and his emerging network of chemists, pilots, and jungle laboratories, northward across the Caribbean to Norman's Cay, where it would be received, stored if necessary, and then loaded onto smaller aircraft or speedboats for the final short hop into Florida. The island functioned as a kind of decompression chamber for the entire operation, a place where a large, dangerous international shipment could be broken down into smaller, more easily concealed loads before making its final approach into American territory, evading much of the surveillance that would have caught a direct flight from Colombia. The financial scale of what Lehder built during this period is almost difficult to fully convey in human terms. Estimates of the cocaine moving through Norman's Cay during its peak years range into the thousands of kilograms per month, a volume that dwarfed anything the American drug enforcement apparatus of the late 1970s was prepared to confront. And because cocaine sold at such an enormous markup, a kilogram that might cost a few $1,000s to produce in Colombia could sell for tens of thousands of dollars on the streets of Miami or New York, the profits flowing back to Lehder and his emerging network of Colombian partners were staggering, numbers that would eventually place his personal fortune, at its height, in the billions of dollars. He was, by some later estimates, one of the richest criminals who had ever lived, a young man not yet 30 years old who had transformed himself, within the span of a few short years, from a marijuana smuggler doing time in an American prison into the architect of an entire international drug pipeline. It was during this period that Lehder's partnership with Pablo Escobar and the broader constellation of Medellin traffickers deepened into what would eventually be recognized, retrospectively, as the founding infrastructure of the Medellin cartel, though the cartel as a formalized, self-conscious criminal organization would not fully crystallize until slightly later, once its various leading figures recognized the mutual benefit of coordinating rather than competing. In these earlier years, the relationship functioned more as a loose but increasingly essential alliance. Escobar and his associates controlled much of the production side of the business in Colombia, the coca paste, the jungle refining labs, the network of growers and chemists, while Lehder controlled something arguably even more valuable, the transportation infrastructure that got the finished product into the hands of American buyers. It was a genuine partnership of complementary strengths, and for a time, it worked with a terrifying, seamless efficiency. Lehder's role within this emerging network extended beyond simply providing the physical means of transport. He also brought a genuinely innovative approach to the mechanics of smuggling itself, refining techniques that would influence traffickers for decades to come. He experimented with modifying aircraft to maximize cargo capacity while minimizing radar detection, flying at altitudes and along routes specifically designed to exploit gaps in American and Bahamian air surveillance. He developed relationships with corrupt officials on both sides of the operation, Bahamian officials willing to look away from what was happening at Norman's Cay in exchange for substantial bribes, and, allegedly, contacts within American law enforcement and customs who could be paid to provide warning of increased patrols or planned operations. He recruited pilots aggressively, often young American men drawn by the extraordinary money on offer, sums that could exceed what many of them might have earned in years of legitimate work, for a single successful flight, and in doing so, he built a growing cadre of loyal operatives whose fortunes were now permanently entangled with his own. Yet even as the empire grew, cracks were beginning to form beneath its glittering surface, cracks that would not become fully visible for a few more years, but which were already, in these founding years of the Norman's Cay operation, quietly widening. The very qualities that had made Lehder so effective as a smuggling innovator, his boldness, his willingness to take risks others found reckless, his hunger for attention and self-mythologizing, were also, inevitably, going to draw the kind of scrutiny that a criminal enterprise of this scale could not survive indefinitely. An island transformed almost overnight into an armed compound, with strange aircraft coming and going at all hours, with monkeys roaming its grounds and armed guards patrolling its beaches, was not the kind of thing that could remain invisible forever, however remote its location. Bahamian residents on nearby islands began to talk. American vacationers who had once sailed freely through the Exuma chain began to report being turned away from Norman's Cay's waters by armed men in speedboats, an intrusion into what had once been open Caribbean waters that inevitably drew complaints, and eventually, attention. Compounding the risk was Lehder's own escalating volatility. Cocaine use, by numerous accounts, was heavy among the island's inhabitants, Lehder very much included, and the paranoia that so often accompanies sustained, heavy use of the drug began to manifest in increasingly erratic behavior, outbursts of temper, sudden shifts in loyalty, a growing suspicion even toward men who had been his closest and most trusted associates. Those who worked for him during this period would later describe an atmosphere that combined genuine, intoxicating opportunity with an undercurrent of real danger, the sense that Lehder's moods could turn without warning, that a minor mistake or perceived slight could result in violent retribution, that the island paradise they had all been drawn to was, beneath its surface glamour, ruled by a man whose grip on stability was growing more tenuous even as his wealth and power grew more immense. And there was another danger too, one that would prove, in the end, to be even more consequential than any external law enforcement pressure, the seeds of betrayal being planted within his own inner circle. George Jung, the American partner who had first dreamed with him of a cocaine empire back in that prison cell, remained closely involved in the operation during these years, flying loads and helping coordinate the American distribution side of the business, but the relationship between the two men, never entirely stable, built as it was on the shared ambitions of two deeply self-interested criminals rather than any deeper loyalty, was fraying under the pressure of enormous sums of money. Competing egos, and Lehder's increasingly domineering, unpredictable style of leadership. Other associates, too, were beginning to chafe under an operation that, however lucrative, was becoming harder and harder to control, its founder increasingly a liability as much as an asset. By the very end of the 1970s and into the earliest years of the 1980s, Norman's Cay had become something almost mythical within the world of American and Caribbean drug enforcement, a name whispered by DEA agents and Bahamian officials alike, a known but frustratingly untouchable center of one of the largest cocaine smuggling operations the hemisphere had ever seen. Journalists began to take an interest. Investigative reporters, drawn by rumors of an island transformed into a private smuggler's kingdom, began making inquiries, some even attempting to visit the island themselves, only to be turned away or, in a few documented instances, threatened outright. The story of Norman's Cay was, in other words, beginning to leak out of the shadows and into the light, and for a man who had built his entire empire on secrecy, on the invisibility of his operation, on the simple but essential fact that no government had yet fully grasped the scale of what he had constructed, that exposure represented an existential threat. What Carlos Lehder did not yet fully appreciate, though he would learn it soon, and learn it in the hardest possible way, was that the American government, and specifically the Drug Enforcement Administration, had begun to take serious, sustained notice of what was happening on that small island in the Exumas. Surveillance flights had begun photographing the island's expanded airstrip and the unusual volume of air traffic passing through it. Informants within the broader smuggling network, men and women who had grown frightened or resentful or simply greedy enough to trade information for immunity, had begun quietly feeding details of the operation to federal investigators. The empire that Carlos Lehder had built with such audacious speed, an island kingdom ruled by a self-styled outlaw prince, its coffers overflowing with cocaine money, its skies filled nightly with the drone of aircraft carrying white powder toward the glittering coast of Florida, was about to face the full weight of two governments finally roused to action. And Lehder himself, increasingly consumed by paranoia, by ideological fantasy, by the sheer intoxicating scale of his own success, was about to make a series of decisions that would set in motion the slow, inexorable collapse of everything he had built. That collapse, the raids, the betrayals, the desperate scramble to save an empire already beginning to crumble beneath him, is where our story turns next, into the darkest and most dangerous chapter yet of Carlos Lehder's extraordinary rise and impending fall. If you're still with me in the shadows, let me know, should we keep going? I'll write the next part, where the walls begin closing in on Norman's Cay, whenever you're ready. There is a particular moment in the life of every criminal empire, a moment historians and investigators can usually identify only in hindsight, because at the time it rarely announces itself with any drama, when the balance of power quietly shifts, when the hunter and the hunted trade places without either fully realizing it has happened. For Carlos Lehder and his island kingdom of Norman's Cay, that moment arrived sometime around 1979 and 1980, in the form of a slow, grinding convergence of forces that had been building for years, American journalists finally willing to risk publishing what they had learned, federal investigators finally connecting scattered pieces of intelligence into a coherent picture, and a growing chorus of voices within the Bahamian government itself beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about what exactly was happening on a small island that had somehow transformed itself into an armed compound patrolled by foreign nationals with guns and dogs. The first serious cracks in the wall of secrecy that had protected Norman's Cay appeared not from law enforcement directly, but from the press, and in particular from a small but determined cadre of investigative journalists who had begun hearing the same rumors that had been circulating for years among boaters, pilots, and Bahamian locals, that something deeply strange and almost certainly illegal was happening on an island that had once been an unremarkable vacation spot. Reporters from American outlets began making inquiries, and a few of the boldest attempted to actually visit the island to see for themselves. What they found, when they got close enough, confirmed every rumor and then some. Armed men patrolled the beaches. Boats attempting to approach the harbor, even boats belonging to ordinary tourists simply hoping to anchor for the night as they might have done freely just a few years earlier, were turned away, sometimes at gunpoint. The island's airstrip, once a modest strip of packed earth suitable for small private planes, had been extended and reinforced to handle much larger aircraft, a detail that, to anyone with even passing knowledge of drug trafficking logistics, was an unmistakable signal of exactly what kind of operation was being run there. When these accounts began appearing in print, most notably in a series of articles that painted Norman's Cay as a lawless smuggler's fortress operating with near total impunity in Bahamian waters, the effect was immediate and, from Lehder's perspective, catastrophic. What had functioned for years as a quiet, almost invisible node in an international smuggling network was now a matter of public record, a story that American readers, and more importantly American federal investigators, could no longer pretend not to notice. The Drug Enforcement Administration, which had been slowly building its own intelligence picture of Norman's Cay through surveillance flights and a growing network of informants inside the broader Colombian-American smuggling world, now had public pressure added to its private investigative momentum. This was no longer simply a matter of a persistent criminal operation quietly making its money in a remote corner of the Caribbean. It was becoming, in the eyes of the American press and the American public, a symbol, an audacious, almost cartoonish example of exactly how brazen the cocaine trade had become, an island literally stolen out from under the nose of a sovereign government and turned into a private smuggling base by a man who seemed to answer to no one. The Bahamian government, for its part, found itself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. For years, it seems clear from the historical record that a combination of bribery, willful negligence, and simple lack of resources had allowed the situation at Norman's Cay to develop largely unchecked. Bahamian officials, some of whom were allegedly receiving substantial payments to look the other way, had little incentive to interfere with an operation that, however illegal, brought significant sums of money flowing into certain pockets of the local economy and government. But as international attention grew, as American diplomatic pressure mounted, and as the sheer audacity of the situation became harder and harder to credibly deny, the calculus began to shift. A small nation with limited military and law enforcement capacity, dependent in various ways on American goodwill and tourism revenue, could not indefinitely allow itself to be portrayed in the international press as a rogue state that had essentially ceded sovereign territory to a Colombian drug trafficker. The pressure to act, or at least to be seen to be acting, became difficult to ignore. Yet even as this external pressure mounted, Lehder's operation at Norman's Cay continued to function, continued to move extraordinary quantities of cocaine northward into Florida, and continued to generate the kind of staggering wealth that made the risks, for the moment, feel worth taking. This is one of the most striking aspects of this period in Lehder's story, the the strange, almost surreal coexistence of mounting external danger and continued, even accelerating, criminal success. Pilots continued to fly. Boats continued to run. The parties on the island, by multiple accounts, continued largely unabated, fueled by cocaine and the particular kind of reckless bravado that seems to afflict people living inside a bubble they either cannot or will not admit is beginning to burst. There is a psychological pattern that appears again and again in the biographies of men who build criminal empires of this scale, a kind of willful blindness, an addiction not just to the drug itself but to the adrenaline and grandiosity of the operation, that makes it almost impossible for them to voluntarily scale back even as the warning signs accumulate around them. Lehder, by every account of those who knew him during this period, exhibited this pattern in its most extreme form. If anything, as the pressure increased, his behavior became more erratic, more grandiose, not less. It was during this period of mounting external pressure that Lehder made one of the most consequential and, in retrospect, revealing decisions of his entire criminal career, a decision that illustrates perhaps better than any other single act just how thoroughly his self-image had come to diverge from the reality of his situation. Rather than retreating into the shadows, consolidating his operation, minimizing his public profile in an attempt to weather the growing scrutiny, Lehder instead began moving in the opposite direction entirely, toward public life, toward political ambition, toward an increasingly open embrace of the very visibility that should have terrified a man in his position. He began cultivating a political identity back in Colombia, founding a small political movement, sometimes referred to as a nationalist or populist party, that mixed genuine, if erratically articulated, political grievances against American imperialism and Colombian political corruption with what can only be described as an attempt to launder his own image, to transform himself in the public eye from drug trafficker into political outsider, a champion of ordinary Colombians against what he characterized as the hypocrisy of a United States that consumed enormous quantities of cocaine while sanctimoniously condemning the countries that supplied it. This political dimension of Lehder's persona deserves particular attention, because it separates him meaningfully from the popular image of the cocaine trafficker as purely a creature of greed. Lehder, whatever else can be said about him, appears to have genuinely believed, at least in part, in the ideological framework he constructed around his criminal activity. He gave interviews, remarkably candid interviews, astonishing in retrospect for a man supposedly running one of the largest drug trafficking operations in the hemisphere, in which he railed against American drug policy, against what he saw as Yankee hypocrisy, against the historical exploitation of Latin America by the United States. He spoke admiringly, in these same interviews and in private conversations recounted by those who knew him, of revolutionary figures and anti-imperialist movements, weaving together a strange ideological tapestry that combined elements of leftist anti-Americanism with an almost fascistic admiration for ruthless strongman leadership, a combination that struck many who encountered it as incoherent, even unhinged, but which seemed, to Lehder himself, to form a genuinely felt worldview. Whether this political posturing was sincere ideological conviction, calculated image management, cocaine-fueled grandiosity, or, as is perhaps most likely, some unstable mixture of all three, it had the practical effect of making Lehder an increasingly public figure at precisely the moment when his criminal operation most needed him to disappear from view. Every interview he gave, every political rally he attended, every public statement railing against the American government, kept his name and his face in circulation, made him more recognizable, more discussed, more impossible for law enforcement on either side of the operation to ignore. It was as though some part of him, the part that had always craved not just wealth but recognition, not just power but the acknowledgement of that power by others, could not resist the pull of visibility even as the more disciplined, calculating part of his mind must have understood the danger it represented. Meanwhile, back on Norman's Cay, the practical machinery of the smuggling operation was beginning to strain under pressures both external and internal. The increased scrutiny meant that flights had to be timed more carefully, routes altered more frequently, payments to corrupt officials increased to maintain their cooperation in an environment of growing risk. Some pilots and associates, sensing the tide beginning to turn, quietly began distancing themselves from the operation, either cutting ties entirely or, in a pattern that would prove far more dangerous to Lehder, beginning to cooperate secretly with American investigators in exchange for leniency on their own, separate legal troubles. The DEA strategy, as it took shape during this period, relied heavily on exactly this kind of internal erosion, the recognition that an organization built on greed and self-interest, rather than genuine loyalty or shared ideology, was inherently vulnerable to the promise of a deal, a reduced sentence, a chance to walk away from the consequences of one's own involvement by helping to bring down the man at the top. George Jung, Lehder's original partner and the man with whom he had first dreamed of a cocaine empire back in an American prison cell, remained a significant figure in the operation during this period, though the relationship between the two men had grown increasingly strained. Accounts from those close to the operation describe a partnership that had curdled under the weight of enormous wealth and Lehder's increasingly domineering, unpredictable behavior. Jung, despite his own considerable criminal history and undeniable role in building the operation's American distribution network, found himself treated less as an equal partner and more as a subordinate, a dynamic that bred resentment even as the two men remained, for the time being, bound together by the sheer scale of what they had built and the mutual danger they now faced. This fraying of the original partnership between Lehder and Jung would prove to be one of many fault lines within the broader operation, fault lines that law enforcement, sensing weakness, would soon learn to exploit with devastating effectiveness. It was against this backdrop, mounting press scrutiny, growing diplomatic pressure on the Bahamian government, an increasingly public and politically active Lehder, and a network of associates beginning to fray under stress, that the first serious law enforcement action against Norman's Cay finally took shape. In 1979, the Bahamian government, no longer able to credibly ignore the situation and facing genuine pressure from Washington, authorized a police raid on the island, an operation intended to finally assert Bahamian sovereignty over territory that had, in all practical terms, ceased to function as anything resembling normal Bahamian jurisdiction for years. The raid, when it came, revealed both the scale of what Lehder had built and the profound difficulty of actually dismantling it. Officers found evidence of the operation's scale, the reinforced airstrip, signs of the private security apparatus, indications of the enormous volume of air traffic that had been passing through, but the raid, like many law enforcement actions against deeply entrenched, well-funded criminal operations, produced frustratingly limited concrete results in terms of arrests or seizures substantial enough to permanently disrupt the operation. Lehder himself, forewarned by his network of informants and corrupt contacts within the Bahamian government itself, was not present when the raid occurred, having left the island in advance, a pattern of narrow, almost supernaturally well-timed escapes that would repeat itself several more times over the following years, and that speaks to just how deeply his corruption of local officials had penetrated the very institutions supposedly tasked with stopping him. This pattern, public exposure, official raid, minimal concrete result, operation resuming shortly thereafter, would repeat itself with variations over the next several years, creating a strange, almost theatrical rhythm to the slow-motion unraveling of Lehder's Bahamian operation. Each raid chipped away a little more at the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Norman's Cay in its earliest years, each piece of press coverage made it a little harder for Bahamian officials to maintain the fiction that nothing untoward was occurring, and each departure by Lehder himself, fleeing just ahead of law enforcement, added to a growing sense, both within his own organization and among the investigators pursuing him, that his charmed run of invincibility, however extended it had already proven to be, could not continue indefinitely. By 1980 and into 1981, the pressure had become severe enough that Lehder's presence on Norman's Cay itself became increasingly sporadic, increasingly risky, forcing him to spend more time back in Colombia, deepening his relationships with Pablo Escobar and the broader Medellin trafficking network even as his signature achievement, the island fortress that had made him one of the wealthiest criminals alive, slipped gradually out of his direct control. It is a pattern worth noting, because it illustrates something important about the arc of Lehder's entire career. Even as one chapter of his criminal enterprise began to close under the weight of external pressure, he was already, almost instinctively, pivoting toward the next phase of his ambitions, deepening his alliance with the men who would soon formalize what history would come to know as the Medellin cartel, a criminal organization whose scale and violence would come to dwarf even what had been achieved at Norman's Cay. This period also saw the beginning of a critical shift in the fundamental logistics of the cocaine trade itself, one in which Lehder played a genuinely pioneering, if ultimately self-defeating, role. Even as Bahamian and American pressure made Norman's Cay increasingly untenable as a primary smuggling hub, Lehder and his associates began developing and refining alternative routes and methods, larger aircraft capable of flying directly from Colombia to remote airstrips in the United States without needing an intermediate Caribbean waypoint at all, more sophisticated methods of concealment, deeper and more elaborate networks of bribery reaching further into both the Bahamian and, disturbingly, elements of the American law enforcement and customs apparatus. In this sense, the very success of the pressure campaign against Norman's Cay had an unintended and darkly ironic consequence. It forced the emerging Medellin cartel to innovate, to diversify, to become more resilient and less dependent on any single point of vulnerability, lessons that would make the cartel, in its coming years of full maturity under the joint leadership of men like Escobar, the Ochoa brothers, and Lehder himself, an even more formidable and difficult to dismantle criminal enterprise than the relatively centralized, single-island operation that had first made Lehder's fortune. But for Lehder personally, the writing on the wall was becoming difficult to ignore, however much his own psychology, increasingly shaped by heavy cocaine use, by the intoxicating effects of extraordinary wealth and power, by a genuine and perhaps unshakable belief in his own invincibility, seemed to resist acknowledging it. The island that had been his kingdom, the private fortress that had transformed him from an ambitious young smuggler into one of the wealthiest and most notorious criminals in the world, was slipping away, piece by piece, raid by raid, headline by headline. And even as he pivoted toward new alliances, new routes, new ambitions, including, astonishingly, a continued and even intensifying involvement in Colombian politics that would soon see him attempt something almost unimaginable for a man in his position, the forces arrayed against him were beginning, slowly but with gathering momentum, to close in. The DEA's investigative file on Carlos Lehder was growing thicker by the month. Informants within his own organization, sensing the shifting tide, were beginning to talk. And in Colombia, a political and criminal landscape that Lehder had helped to shape was about to enter a period of violence and chaos that would ultimately consume him along with almost everyone else who had helped build the empire of cocaine that was now flooding, in ever greater quantities, into the veins of American cities. The full collapse of Norman's Cay, the escalating war between the Colombian government and the cartel Lehder had helped found, and the beginning of the manhunt that would eventually end his reign entirely, these are the threads that our story picks up next, as the walls close in on a man who built a kingdom out of cocaine and now watches, with a mixture of fury and disbelief, as that kingdom begins to come apart in his hands. If you're still with me in the shadows, let me know, should we keep going? I'll write the next part, covering the fall of Norman's Cay and the birth of the Medellin cartel's war with the world, whenever you're ready. By 1982, the island that had once seemed untouchable was, in every practical sense, finished as a functioning smuggling base, though it would take one final, almost anticlimactic push to formally close the chapter that had begun with such audacious ambition just a few years earlier. The combination of sustained American diplomatic pressure, mounting international press coverage, and a Bahamian government that could no longer afford the embarrassment of appearing to have surrendered sovereign territory to a foreign drug trafficker finally produced what years of individual raids had failed to achieve, a sustained, coordinated effort to permanently reclaim Norman's Cay. Bahamian authorities, this time working more closely with American intelligence and law enforcement than they had during the earlier, largely symbolic raids, moved to seize control of the island's infrastructure, arrest what remaining personnel could be found, and dismantle the physical apparatus of the smuggling operation that had operated there for the better part of half a decade. Lehder himself, by this point spending increasing amounts of time in Colombia rather than on the island that bore the marks of his empire's founding, was not present for this final reckoning, a pattern of absence that had, by now, become so consistent that it strained credulity to call it mere luck. It reflected, more than anything, the depth of his intelligence network, the sheer number of people across two nations who had been paid, over the years, to ensure that Carlos Lehder always seemed to know, just in time, when it was wise to be somewhere else. The loss of Norman's Cay, when it finally became undeniable and permanent, represented far more than the loss of a single piece of real estate, however strategically valuable that real estate had been. It represented the end of the first, foundational phase of Lehder's criminal career, the phase in which he had operated as something close to an independent operator, a man who had built his own private kingdom and ruled it according to his own rules, answerable to no cartel structure, no formal partnership, nothing beyond his own ambition and the loyalty, however unstable, of the men he had recruited to fly his planes and guard his beaches. What replaced it was something different in character, if not necessarily in scale, a deepening integration into the emerging structure of what the world would soon come to know as the Medellin cartel, a formalized, if always fractious, alliance between Lehder, Pablo Escobar, the Ochoa family, and a handful of other major Colombian traffickers who had come to recognize, in the early years of the 1980s, that the sheer scale of the American cocaine market demanded a level of coordination and shared infrastructure that no single trafficker, however brilliant or ruthless, could sustain alone. It is worth pausing here to consider the strange, almost paradoxical nature of this transition for a man like Lehder. Here was someone whose entire criminal philosophy had been built around independence, around control, around the conviction that true security lay not in partnership but in ownership, of an island, of an airstrip, of an entire private logistics network that answered to him and him alone. And yet the very success of that philosophy, the very scale of wealth and infrastructure it had generated, had made him simply too valuable, too central to the broader Colombian cocaine trade, to remain fully independent. Pablo Escobar, whose control over cocaine production and refining in and around Medellin had grown immensely during these same years, needed reliable transportation routes into the United States at a volume that increasingly exceeded what any single smuggler, even one as innovative as Lehder, could provide alone. The Ochoa brothers, whose family had deep roots in both legitimate ranching and increasingly illegitimate trafficking enterprises, brought their own networks, their own capital, their own connections to the emerging alliance. And so, almost inevitably, the era of Lehder as sole proprietor gave way to the era of Lehder as one partner, albeit an extraordinarily wealthy and influential one, among several, in an enterprise whose scale would soon dwarf anything a single man, however audacious, could have built alone. This period, roughly spanning 1981 through 1983, is often identified by historians of the drug trade as the true founding era of the Medellin cartel as a coherent, if informal, criminal organization, a loose confederation of independently wealthy traffickers who recognized that cooperation on logistics, on bribery networks, on shared intelligence about law enforcement activity, served all their interests better than continued competition. The cartel that emerged from this period was not a hierarchical organization in the sense that popular imagination often assumes, with Escobar issuing orders down a chain of command to subordinates including Lehder. It was, rather, closer to a cartel in the classical economic sense of the term, a group of powerful, independent producers coordinating to maximize collective profit and minimize collective risk, each maintaining substantial autonomy over his own operations while contributing resources, routes, and expertise to shared undertakings. Lehder's particular contribution to this alliance, drawing on the hard-won expertise of the Norman's K years, centered on exactly the logistical innovations that had made him wealthy in the first place: aircraft modification, route planning, the recruitment and management of pilots willing to take on the enormous risks of long-distance smuggling flights in exchange for extraordinary compensation. Even as this new, more collaborative phase of his career took shape, Lehder's personal behavior continued to display the same volatile, grandiose qualities that had characterized his years on Norman's Cay, qualities that increasingly put him at odds with his new partners, particularly Escobar, whose own approach to the business, however brutal, tended toward a colder, more calculated pragmatism than Lehder's ideologically inflected, often theatrical style. Lehder continued his political activities in Colombia during this period, formally founding and leading a small nationalist political party that positioned itself as a populist, anti-American, anti-establishment movement, drawing on grievances that were, in fairness, genuinely felt by significant portions of the Colombian public: resentment of American drug policy, frustration with the corruption and inequality of Colombia's traditional political establishment, anger at what many Colombians saw as a fundamentally hypocritical arrangement in which their country bore the violence and instability of cocaine production while American consumers bore relatively little of the direct social cost of their own consumption. Lehder gave these grievances a voice, however strange and compromised the messenger delivering them might have been, and for a period he attracted a genuine, if modest, following, young Colombians drawn to his charisma, his anti-American rhetoric, his apparent willingness to say things that more conventional Colombian politicians would not dare articulate publicly. But the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Lehder's political project, a cocaine trafficker positioning himself as a champion of ordinary Colombians against the very forces of corruption and criminality that he himself embodied and profited from on an almost unimaginable scale, was not lost on everyone, and as his political profile grew, so too did the scrutiny directed at the source of his obvious and enormous wealth. Colombian and international journalists, no longer able to ignore the increasingly public figure Lehder had become, began digging more aggressively into his background, his finances, his connections to the broader cocaine trade. Colombian authorities, under growing pressure from Washington to demonstrate seriousness in confronting the cocaine trade that had made Colombia a byword for drug-related violence and corruption, began to view Lehder as an increasingly convenient and increasingly necessary target, a man whose public political activities made him simultaneously more visible and, in the eyes of a government eager to show results, more valuable as a symbol of enforcement action. It was during this period, in 1981, that American authorities formally indicted Carlos Lehder on drug trafficking charges related to the Norman's Cay operation, a legal action that, while it did not result in his immediate capture, given his residence in Colombia and the absence at that time of a functioning extradition arrangement being actively enforced against him, nonetheless marked a significant escalation in the formal legal jeopardy he faced. The indictment meant that Lehder was now, officially and publicly, a wanted man in the United States, a fugitive from American justice whose eventual capture had become a matter of formal legal and diplomatic priority rather than simply an ongoing subject of investigative interest. This development, combined with his growing political prominence within Colombia, placed Lehder in an increasingly precarious position, too wealthy and too central to the cocaine trade to simply retire from the business, too politically ambitious to retreat into anonymity, and now too formally implicated in American criminal proceedings to imagine that his previous pattern of narrow escapes and well-timed absences could continue indefinitely. The broader political and social context in Colombia during this period adds crucial texture to understanding the pressures now bearing down on Lehder and his cartel partners. The early 1980s in Colombia were years of escalating violence and institutional crisis, as the enormous wealth generated by the cocaine trade began to corrupt and destabilize Colombian political and judicial institutions on a scale the country had never before experienced. Judges, journalists, police officers, and politicians who proved unwilling to accept bribes or who actively worked to confront the growing power of traffickers like Escobar and Lehder increasingly found themselves targets of intimidation, and in a rapidly growing number of cases, assassination. This was the beginning of what Colombians would come to call, with grim understatement, narco-terrorism, a campaign of violence directed not at rival criminals but at the institutions of the state itself, an attempt by the emerging cartel structure to ensure that no Colombian government could effectively move against their interests without paying an unbearable price in blood. Against this backdrop of escalating violence, the government of Colombian President Belisario Betancourt, who took office in 1982, found itself navigating an almost impossible set of pressures, American demands for more aggressive action against traffickers, including support for extradition of major figures like Lehder to face justice in the United States. The reality of a domestic security apparatus increasingly compromised by cartel money and cartel violence, and a genuine, widely shared Colombian public sentiment, cultivated in no small part by figures like Lehder himself, that extradition of Colombian citizens to face trial in the United States represented an affront to national sovereignty, a humiliating acknowledgement that Colombia could not or would not hold its own citizens accountable within its own judicial system. This extradition question would become, over the following years, the single most consequential political and legal battleground in the entire war against the Medellin cartel, a fight in which Lehder himself would play an outsized and, in certain respects, uniquely pivotal role, given his particular combination of criminal wealth, political ambition, and ideological conviction regarding what he characterized as American imperial overreach. It was in this charged atmosphere that Lehder made a decision that, in retrospect, stands as one of the most consequential of his entire life. He threw himself with even greater intensity into the campaign against extradition, positioning himself not merely as a criminal seeking to avoid personal legal jeopardy, though he was certainly that, but as a nationalist crusader defending Colombian sovereignty against what he cast as American neo-colonial aggression. He gave interviews to Colombian and international media in which he argued, with a rhetorical fluency that surprised many observers, that extradition represented a fundamental betrayal of Colombian independence, that Colombian citizens accused of crimes should be tried in Colombian courts under Colombian law, regardless of where those alleged crimes had their ultimate market or impact. It was an argument that, stripped of the obvious self-interest motivating the man making it, contained a kernel of genuine political substance, one that resonated with a Colombian public that had long chafed under what many perceived as American condescension toward Latin American sovereignty. And it was an argument that, crucially, Lehder did not make alone. Escobar and other cartel figures, recognizing the existential threat that extradition posed to their entire enterprise, quietly funded and supported the broader anti-extradition political movement, even as they pursued, simultaneously and with escalating brutality, a campaign of violence and intimidation against any Colombian official who dared support extradition publicly. This period also saw a significant, if often underappreciated, dimension of Lehder's activities, his direct financial and logistical support for a range of Colombian paramilitary and guerrilla-adjacent groups, a set of alliances that reflected both pragmatic calculation and his own increasingly erratic ideological commitments. Some accounts describe Lehder providing funding and weapons to right-wing paramilitary organizations that shared his anti-communist, nationalist orientation, groups that would themselves go on to play a devastating role in Colombia's decades-long internal conflict. Other accounts describe more complex, situational alliances with elements of Colombia's leftist guerrilla movements, particularly in contexts where such alliances served the immediate tactical interests of protecting cocaine production and transportation infrastructure in remote regions of the country where government authority was weak or absent. This willingness to align with groups across the ideological spectrum, driven not by consistent political conviction but by the pragmatic calculus of protecting his criminal enterprise, further illustrates the deeply contradictory nature of Lehder's self-presentation as a principled nationalist revolutionary, a self-image that sat, always, in uneasy and ultimately unsustainable tension with the brutal practical realities of the business that had made him wealthy and powerful in the first place. By 1983, the pressure on Lehder had begun to compound from multiple directions simultaneously, in a pattern that would, within just a few more years, prove impossible for even a man of his resources and cunning to withstand. His formal indictment in the United States remained active, creating a permanent legal shadow over any possibility of extradition negotiations turning against him. His political activities in Colombia, however genuinely popular in certain quarters, had made him one of the most publicly recognizable and controversial figures in the entire country, a visibility that cut sharply against the interests of a man whose fortune depended on operations that required, at their core, a degree of secrecy and discretion that his growing fame made increasingly impossible to maintain. And within the Medellin cartel's own internal dynamics, Lehder's volatility, his heavy personal cocaine use, and his increasingly erratic public behavior had begun to generate real tension with partners like Escobar and the Ochoa brothers, men whose own survival instincts, however brutal in their expression, tended toward calculated caution rather than the theatrical, ideologically charged public brinkmanship that had become Lehder's signature. It is a striking historical irony that the very qualities that had made Carlos Lehder such an extraordinarily effective innovator in the earliest years of his criminal career, his willingness to take risks others found reckless, his hunger for attention and self-mythologizing, his genuine ideological passion, however incoherent, were now, in this new and more dangerous phase of the Colombian drug war, becoming the very qualities most likely to bring about his downfall. The island fortress was gone. The formalized cartel structure that had replaced his earlier, more independent operation offered wealth and continued criminal opportunity, but also brought him into closer, more consequential alignment with partners whose patience for his instability was not unlimited. And the Colombian government, facing escalating American pressure and an escalating internal war against the traffickers who had begun murdering judges, journalists, and officials with terrifying regularity, was approaching a breaking point that would soon produce the kind of dramatic, high-stakes confrontation that Lehder's entire life and career had, in retrospect, been building toward almost from the moment he first stepped off a plane on a forgotten Bahamian island and decided it would be his. The escalating war between the Colombian state and the Medellin cartel, the assassination of a Colombian justice minister that would change the entire trajectory of the conflict, and the beginning of the final, desperate manhunt for Carlos Lehder himself. These are the threads our story picks up next. As the outlaw king who once ruled an island now finds himself hunted across an entire continent by forces he can no longer outrun, outspend, or outtalk. If you're still with me in the shadows, let me know. Should we keep going? I'll write the next part, covering the war with the Colombian state and the tightening net around Lehder, whenever you're ready. On the last day of April, 1984, a single gunshot in the streets of Bogotá would change the entire trajectory of Colombia's war against the cocaine trade, and with it, seal the fate of Carlos Lehder as decisively as any indictment or extradition treaty ever could. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, Colombia's Minister of Justice, had spent the better part of 2 years building a reputation as the single most fearless and effective enemy the Medellin cartel had yet faced within the Colombian government itself, a young, idealistic politician who had made confronting the traffickers, and confronting Pablo Escobar in particular, the defining cause of his public life. Lara Bonilla had gone further than almost any Colombian official before him, publicly exposing the drug money that had helped finance Escobar's own brief and audacious run for a seat in the Colombian Congress, a scandal that had already forced Escobar out of formal politics and, in the process, humiliated a man whose ego could not easily absorb public disgrace. Lara Bonilla had also become one of the most forceful voices in the Colombian government pushing for the aggressive use of extradition, arguing without hesitation that Colombian traffickers, Lehder included, should be sent to face trial in American courts where the reach of cartel money and cartel violence could not so easily corrupt the proceedings. For men like Escobar and Lehder, both already fighting a desperate rearguard political battle to prevent extradition from becoming Colombian government policy in practice as well as in principle, Lara Bonilla represented an intolerable threat, and on that April afternoon, gunmen on a motorcycle pulled alongside the minister's car in Bogotá traffic and shot him dead. The assassination sent immediate shockwaves through Colombian society and through the Colombian government, transforming what had, until that point, been a simmering, largely rhetorical conflict between the state and the traffickers into something the Colombian public could no longer avoid recognizing as an open war. President Belisario Betancourt, who had previously approached the extradition question with considerable caution, mindful of the genuine public sentiment against what many Colombians viewed as a violation of national sovereignty, now found that caution politically and morally untenable. Within days of the assassination, the Colombian government declared a state of siege, granting security forces sweeping emergency powers, and began actively invoking the extradition treaty with the United States for the first time in a serious and sustained way, moving to identify, locate, and extradite the major figures of the Medellin cartel, with Carlos Lehder, given his already standing American indictment and his unusually high public profile, sitting near the very top of that list. The assassination of Lara Bonilla marks, in the retrospective judgment of nearly every serious historian of the Colombian drug war, the true beginning of the full-scale, openly violent conflict between the Colombian state and the cartel that would come to be known, with grim accuracy, as narco-terrorism, a campaign that would eventually claim thousands of lives over the following decade, encompassing car bombings, the assassination of judges, presidential candidates, journalists, and police officers, and a level of sustained societal violence that would leave permanent scars on Colombian national life. For Carlos Lehder, whose entire political project had been built around positioning himself as a legitimate voice of Colombian nationalism rather than simply a criminal seeking to protect his own interests, the assassination represented a devastating blow to whatever remained of that carefully constructed public image. Whatever ambiguity had previously allowed him to be discussed, in certain circles, as a controversial but not entirely illegitimate political figure evaporated in the aftermath of Lara Bonilla's murder. He was now, unambiguously, and in the eyes of the vast majority of the Colombian public, simply one of the men responsible, whether directly or through his broader association with Escobar and the cartel's collective interests, for the killing of a widely admired public servant. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, as Colombian security forces began mounting the most serious and sustained operations yet against the cartel's infrastructure, Lehder found himself forced into an increasingly precarious, itinerant existence, moving between hideouts in the remote and often lawless regions of Colombia where cartel money, cartel-funded paramilitary protection, and the simple difficulty of the terrain combined to keep government forces at bay. This marked a profound transformation in the conditions of his life. The man who had once ruled a private Caribbean island, who had thrown lavish parties fueled by his own product, who had given confident interviews to international journalists and mounted a public political campaign complete with rallies and a formal party structure, was now living the life of a hunted fugitive, dependent on the loyalty and discretion of bodyguards, local allies, and the sheer difficulty of Colombia's mountainous and jungle terrain to remain beyond the reach of a government now under enormous domestic and international pressure to bring him to justice. It would be a mistake, however, to imagine that this period represented a simple, linear decline for Lehder or for the broader cartel structure of which he remained a part. Even as government pressure mounted, the cartel's capacity for violence and intimidation grew in tandem, in a grim arms race between state enforcement capability and cartel retaliatory capacity that defined the middle years of the 1980s in Colombia. The cartel, and Escobar in particular, responded to the post-Lara Bonilla crackdown with an escalating campaign of violence specifically targeted at discouraging any further government action, particularly around the question of extradition. Judges who ruled in favor of extradition proceedings against cartel figures found themselves and their families threatened, and in a number of documented cases, murdered. The cartel developed and openly publicized a chilling piece of strategic messaging that would come to define this entire era of the conflict: the offer, presented to Colombian officials and judges, of what became known as plata o plomo, silver or lead, accept a bribe and cooperate, or be killed. It was a strategy of terror explicitly designed to make the machinery of Colombian justice either complicit or too frightened to function, and for a considerable period, it proved devastatingly effective. Lehder's own role within this escalating campaign of violence during his fugitive years remains, in certain respects, less thoroughly documented than his earlier, more publicly visible activities at Norman's Cay and in Colombian electoral politics, in part because the nature of his existence during this period was necessarily more clandestine, more dependent on secrecy for his very survival. What is clear from the historical and journalistic record is that he remained deeply embedded within the broader cartel structure, continuing to contribute his logistical expertise to ongoing smuggling operations even as he moved between hideouts to avoid capture, and that he continued, even in these more constrained circumstances, to display the same combination of grandiosity and ideological conviction that had characterized his earlier public life. Associates and later informants who had contact with him during this period described a man who remained, even as a hunted fugitive, given to expansive monologues about politics, history, and his own place within a broader narrative of resistance against American imperial power, a self-conception that seemed, if anything, to intensify rather than diminish under the pressure of his increasingly desperate circumstances. The dynamic between Lehder and his primary cartel partner, Pablo Escobar, also underwent significant strain during this period, a tension rooted in both practical and personal factors. Escobar, whose own approach to managing the escalating conflict with the Colombian state tended toward a colder, more calculated brutality than Lehder's ideologically inflected public posturing, reportedly grew increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as Lehder's continued recklessness, his inability or unwillingness to simply disappear into the kind of disciplined, low-visibility existence that effective evasion of capture demanded. There were also, according to various accounts from journalists and researchers who later reconstructed this period of cartel history, tensions rooted in more mundane matters of business, disputes over the division of profits, disagreements over operational priorities, the kind of friction that inevitably develops between powerful, egotistical men bound together by mutual interest rather than genuine trust or affection. These tensions would prove, in time, to be of considerable consequence, though their full impact would not become clear until later in Lehder's story, when the question of loyalty within the cartel's upper ranks would prove decisive in determining his ultimate fate. Meanwhile, American law enforcement and intelligence agencies, working in increasingly close, if still imperfect, coordination with their Colombian counterparts, continued to refine and intensify their efforts to locate and capture Lehder specifically, recognizing him as one of the most significant and, in certain respects, most vulnerable targets among the senior leadership of the Medellin cartel. His public profile, built over years of political activity and media engagement, meant that American and Colombian investigators had a far richer body of intelligence about his associates, his patterns of behavior, and his ideological worldview than they possessed about many other cartel figures who had maintained a lower and more disciplined public profile throughout their criminal careers. This intelligence advantage would prove crucial in the operations that were, even as Lehder continued to evade capture through 1985 and into early 1986, gradually narrowing the circle of safety within which he could operate. The broader Colombian conflict during this period also saw one of the most dramatic and consequential episodes of the entire drug war, an event that, while not directly involving Lehder, profoundly shaped the political and security environment within which he was attempting to survive as a fugitive. In November of 1985, a leftist guerrilla group known as M19, in what many investigators and historians have long suspected, though never definitively proven, involved at least tacit cartel financing and encouragement, launched a violent siege of the Palace of Justice in Bogotá, Colombia's supreme judicial building. The siege, intended in part to destroy court records related to extradition proceedings against major traffickers, ended in a catastrophic military assault that resulted in the deaths of dozens of people, including 11 of Colombia's own Supreme Court justices. The Palace of Justice siege stands as one of the darkest and most consequential episodes in modern Colombian history, a stark and horrifying illustration of just how thoroughly the drug war had come to threaten the fundamental institutions of the Colombian state itself. While Lehder's direct involvement in planning or financing the siege remains a matter of historical debate rather than settled fact, the event unmistakably intensified the Colombian government's determination to break the power of the cartel, adding yet another layer of urgency to the ongoing manhunt for its senior leadership. It was within this atmosphere of escalating national crisis, intensifying American pressure, and a Colombian security apparatus now operating with unprecedented resolve and, crucially, unprecedented intelligence cooperation from informants within the cartel's own ranks, that the final phase of the hunt for Carlos Lehder began to take shape in early 1987. By this point, Lehder had been living as a fugitive for nearly 3 years, moving between a shrinking number of safe locations, increasingly isolated from the broader political and social world in which he had once thrived as a public figure, dependent for his continued freedom on the loyalty of a diminishing circle of associates whose own willingness to risk everything to protect him was, inevitably, beginning to erode under the weight of American reward money, Colombian government pressure, and simple self-preservation. The specific chain of events that finally led investigators to Lehder's location remains, even in retrospective accounts, a matter of some dispute regarding the precise details, but the broader outline is clear. Colombian security forces, working with intelligence provided by American agencies and, critically, by informants within Lehder's own diminishing network of protection, tracked him to a remote farmhouse in the mountainous Colombian region where he had been hiding. In February of 1987, in an operation that Colombian authorities would later present as a triumphant demonstration of their commitment to confronting the cartel, security forces closed in on Lehder's location. Unlike the earlier raids on Norman's Cay, which had repeatedly found the island's owner conveniently absent, this operation would not end in another narrow escape. Colombian forces captured Carlos Lehder alive, bringing to an end nearly 3 years as a fugitive and, with his capture, setting in motion a final sequence of events that would prove almost as historically significant as anything that had come before, because unlike virtually every other major Colombian trafficker captured or killed during this period, Lehder would not simply face trial or imprisonment within Colombia's own compromised and dangerous judicial system. He would become the very first major Colombian cocaine trafficker to actually be extradited to the United States to face trial, a landmark moment in the drug war that both validated and, in its way, punished the very political crusade against extradition that Lehder himself had helped to lead. The capture and extradition of Carlos Lehder sent shockwaves through the Medellin cartel's leadership and through the broader Colombian underworld, serving as a stark demonstration that the years of intimidation, assassination, and political maneuvering aimed at preventing extradition had not, in the end, been sufficient to guarantee the safety of even the cartel's most prominent and politically active figures. For Escobar and the Ochoa brothers, Lehder's extradition represented both a genuine loss, the removal of a talented and valuable operational partner, and, in certain accounts from those close to the cartel's inner workings, a source of considerable private satisfaction, given the tensions and resentments that had built up over Lehder's years of increasingly erratic and attention-drawing behavior. Whatever grief or anger Lehder's former partners may have privately felt at his capture, it would not translate into any serious effort to rescue him or prevent his extradition, a telling and ultimately devastating indication of just how isolated Lehder had become within the very criminal fraternity he had helped to build. For Lehder himself, the moment of his capture marked the definitive end of the extraordinary, audacious criminal life he had constructed over the preceding decade and a half, the end of the island kingdom, the end of the political ambitions, the end of the carefully cultivated image of himself as an outlaw revolutionary standing against American imperial power. What awaited him now was not a Colombian courtroom, where cartel money and cartel intimidation might still have offered some hope of leniency or delay, but an American federal court, operating under American law, prosecuted by American attorneys determined to make his case a defining, precedent-setting demonstration of what awaited even the wealthiest and most powerful cocaine traffickers when American justice finally caught up with them. The trial that followed, the testimony that would emerge from it, and the sentence that would ultimately be handed down to the man who had once ruled his own island, these form the final, sobering chapters of Carlos Lehder's extraordinary and terrible story, chapters in which the outlaw king finally faces, for the first time in his adult life, a reckoning he cannot outrun, outspend, or outtalk. If you're still with me in the shadows, let me know, should we keep going? I'll write the next part, covering Lehder's extradition, trial, and the beginning of his life behind bars, whenever you're ready. There is a particular kind of silence that descends over a man who has spent his entire adult life believing himself untouchable, in the moment he finally understands that he is not. For Carlos Lehder, that moment arrived somewhere over the Caribbean, aboard an aircraft carrying him not toward another hidden airstrip or another triumphant return to power, but toward American federal custody, in a flight that retraced, in cruel and deliberate irony, almost the exact geography of the smuggling routes he had spent years perfecting. In February of 1987, Lehder became the first major Colombian cocaine trafficker in history to be extradited to the United States to face trial, a moment of profound symbolic as well as practical significance, not only for Lehder himself but for the entire trajectory of the war against the Medellin cartel. For years, the cartel's leadership had fought the very possibility of extradition with everything at their disposal, political funding, public campaigns, and a campaign of assassination and intimidation so severe it had reshaped Colombian national life. That fight had, in the case of Carlos Lehder, finally and definitively failed. He was flown first to Florida, the very state whose shores had received, over the years, an almost unimaginable tonnage of cocaine funneled through the operation he had built at Norman's Cay, and it was in Jacksonville, Florida, that Carlos Lehder would ultimately stand trial before a United States federal court, a trial that prosecutors, from the very outset, intended to use not merely as a vehicle for convicting one man, but as a definitive, historic demonstration of America's capacity and determination to bring the architects of the cocaine epidemic to justice, regardless of how much wealth, power, or political protection they had accumulated in their home country. The scale of the legal apparatus assembled against Lehder reflected this ambition. Federal prosecutors built a case drawing on years of accumulated intelligence, physical evidence recovered from the Norman's Cay operation and subsequent investigations, and, most consequentially of all, the testimony of cooperating witnesses drawn from deep within Lehder's own former criminal network, men who had once flown his planes, guarded his island, and shared in the extraordinary wealth his operation had generated, and who now, facing their own legal jeopardy, had made the calculated decision to trade information about their former partner for more lenient treatment of their own crimes. Chief among these cooperating witnesses was George Jung, the American partner with whom Lehder had first dreamed of a cocaine empire back in a prison cell more than a decade earlier, the man whose own connections and criminal ingenuity had helped provide the essential American distribution infrastructure that had made the Norman's Cay operation so extraordinarily profitable. The relationship between Lehder and Jung, as we've seen, had frayed considerably over the years of their partnership, strained by Lehder's increasingly domineering and unpredictable behavior and by the corrosive effects of enormous wealth on what had never been, at its foundation, anything resembling genuine friendship or loyalty. By the time federal prosecutors approached Jung, already facing substantial legal troubles of his own related to his continued involvement in drug trafficking after the collapse of the original partnership, the calculus of self-preservation proved more compelling than whatever remained of his old alliance with Lehder. Jung agreed to testify against his former partner and mentor in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing prosecutors with detailed, credible, first-hand testimony about the founding, structure, and operation of the Norman's Cay smuggling network, testimony that would prove devastating to Lehder's defense. The trial itself, which unfolded over the course of 1987 and into 1988, became something of a spectacle, drawing intense media coverage both in the United States and in Colombia, where the proceedings were followed with a mixture of fascination, vindication, and, among certain segments of the population still sympathetic to Lehder's anti-American political rhetoric, resentment at what was portrayed as yet another example of American overreach against Colombian sovereignty. Lehder's defense strategy, insofar as one existed in any coherent form, seemed to reflect the same combination of genuine political conviction and calculated self-interest that had characterized his entire public career. He and his legal team attempted, at various points, to frame the prosecution as a politically motivated persecution, an American attempt to punish him not simply for drug trafficking but for his outspoken criticism of American drug policy and American foreign relations with Latin America. This defense, whatever rhetorical power it may have carried in front of a sympathetic Colombian audience, found little purchase in an American federal courtroom operating under the weight of overwhelming physical and testimonial evidence, presided over by a judicial system with little patience for arguments that amounted, in substance, to a claim that the defendant's ideological opposition to American policy should somehow exempt him from prosecution for smuggling what prosecutors would eventually calculate as many tons of cocaine into the United States over the course of his criminal career. The testimony that emerged during the trial painted an extraordinarily detailed picture of the Norman's Cay operation at the height of its power, the scale of the aircraft fleet, the volume of cocaine moved, the network of bribed officials, the almost surreal atmosphere of the island itself during its years as Lehder's private smuggling kingdom. Witnesses described the parties, the exotic animals, the armed guards and attack dogs, the strange and volatile personality of the man at the center of it all, a portrait that, even as it served the narrow legal purpose of establishing Lehder's guilt beyond reasonable doubt, also had the effect of cementing in the public imagination the almost mythical, larger-than-life quality of the empire he had built. It was, in a sense, the final and most public performance of the persona Lehder had spent years cultivating, except now the audience was a federal jury rather than an adoring crowd of political supporters, and the outcome of the performance would determine not his continued freedom and wealth, but the length of the prison sentence he would spend the remainder of his life serving. In May of 1988, after a trial that had lasted months and involved dozens of witnesses and an enormous body of physical and documentary evidence, a federal jury in Jacksonville convicted Carlos Lehder on a range of charges related to drug trafficking and conspiracy, finding that he had played a central, founding role in one of the largest cocaine smuggling operations in American history. The conviction was, in every meaningful sense, total and unambiguous, closing off any remaining possibility that Lehder might escape accountability for the empire he had built. The sentencing that followed, delivered in July of 1988, reflected the extraordinary scale of the crimes for which he had been convicted. Carlos Lehder was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional consecutive term of 135 years, a sentence so severe, so far beyond any realistic possibility of eventual release under its original terms, that it stood, at the time, as one of the harshest sentences ever handed down in an American drug trafficking case, a deliberate and explicit statement by the American judicial system that the era of untouchable cocaine kingpins operating with impunity was, at least in this one case, definitively over. The severity of the sentence reflected not only the sheer scale of Lehder's crimes but also the particular symbolic weight that his case carried within the broader American war on drugs, which had, by the late 1980s, become one of the defining political and social preoccupations of the era. Crack cocaine had by this point ravaged American inner cities with a ferocity that had transformed public and political attitudes toward the drug trade from a relatively marginal law enforcement concern into a central issue of national politics, with both major American political parties competing to appear tougher on drug crime than their opponents. Lehder, as the first major Colombian trafficker to be successfully extradited and convicted, became in this context an almost irresistible symbol for American prosecutors and politicians alike, proof that the American government could and would reach across international borders to hold accountable even the wealthiest, most politically connected architects of the cocaine trade, and a warning to every other major trafficker still operating with apparent impunity in Colombia that a similar fate might, eventually, await them as well. For Lehder personally, the sentence marked the definitive, irreversible end of the extraordinary life he had built over the preceding decade and a half. The island kingdom was gone. The political movement he had founded, whatever genuine following it had once commanded among segments of the Colombian public sympathetic to his anti-American rhetoric, had collapsed entirely, its leader now a convicted felon serving a sentence that made any future political relevance essentially impossible. The billions of dollars in wealth he had accumulated over the years of his criminal career had, by this point, been largely dispersed, seized, or simply lost track of amid the chaos of his years as a fugitive, leaving him, whatever resources his family or associates might still have controlled on his behalf, functionally destitute within the confines of the American federal prison system, a system that offered no accommodation whatsoever for the kind of wealth and influence that had once allowed him to bribe officials, fund political movements, and construct an entire private smuggling kingdom out of a forgotten Bahamian island. What followed his conviction and sentencing was, for a man whose entire adult life had been defined by extraordinary visibility, extraordinary risk, and extraordinary consequence, a long and largely unremarkable period of federal incarceration, decades spent moving through the American prison system, his once famous name gradually fading from active public discussion even as it remained within the specific historical literature on the drug war and the Medellin cartel, a permanently significant reference point. There was, however, one further twist in Lehder's story that deserves particular attention, because it illustrates, in its own way, the final and perhaps most historically consequential act of his criminal career. In a development that emerged some years after his initial conviction, it became known that Lehder had, at some point following his sentencing, agreed to cooperate with American authorities, providing testimony and information related to Manuel Noriega, the Panamanian dictator whose own extensive involvement in facilitating cocaine trafficking through Panama had made him, by the early 1990s, a major target of American law enforcement and, eventually, of direct American military intervention. Lehder's cooperation in the Noriega case, offered in exchange for the possibility of eventual sentence reduction, represented a final, almost poetic irony in the arc of his story. The man who had once postured as a defiant anti-American revolutionary, willing to go to prison rather than compromise his ideological opposition to American power, ultimately choosing, when faced with the reality of spending the remainder of his natural life within an American prison cell, to cooperate with the very American justice system he had spent years publicly denouncing, in pursuit of whatever modest reduction in his sentence such cooperation might eventually secure. This final chapter of pragmatic cooperation, however much it may complicate the more romanticized image of Lehder as an uncompromising outlaw revolutionary that he himself had worked so hard to construct during his years of freedom, is in many ways entirely consistent with the deeper pattern that runs through his entire life story, a pattern in which genuine ideological conviction, however real it may have been in the moment, always ultimately proved subordinate to the more fundamental drives of self-preservation, ambition, and an unwavering, almost pathological commitment to his own survival and advancement, whatever the cost to those around him or to whatever principles he claimed, in any given moment, to represent. It is the same pattern that had led him, years earlier, to abandon the relatively modest ambitions of marijuana smuggling for the vastly more lucrative and dangerous cocaine trade, the same pattern that had led him to prioritize his own political visibility even as that visibility made him increasingly vulnerable to law enforcement, and the same pattern that had, in the final analysis, left him almost entirely alone at the moment of his capture, abandoned by cartel partners who had grown weary of his volatility and unwilling to risk their own safety to protect a man whose usefulness to their shared enterprise had, by that point, been thoroughly exhausted. As the years passed within the confines of the American federal prison system, the world that Carlos Lehder had once dominated continued to change dramatically around him, in ways that only deepened the sense of historical significance attached to his particular story. Pablo Escobar, his former partner and, in certain respects, his most significant rival within the loose confederation of the Medellin cartel, would meet his own violent end in December of 1993, killed in a rooftop shootout in Medellin after years spent as one of the most hunted men on the planet, his own empire having grown, in its final years, into something of even greater scale and violence than anything Lehder himself had built, before collapsing just as completely under the combined weight of Colombian, American, and rival cartel pressure. The Ochoa brothers, following a markedly different path, would eventually negotiate surrenders to Colombian authorities under terms considerably more favorable than anything Lehder had ultimately received, serving relatively modest sentences within the Colombian prison system before returning, in later years, to considerably more conventional and, in certain cases, ostensibly legitimate business pursuits. The broader structure of the Medellin cartel itself would be effectively dismantled by the mid-1990s, its dominance of the international cocaine trade gradually ceded to rival organizations, including the Cali cartel and, in later decades, an entirely new generation of Mexican trafficking organizations that would come to dominate the movement of cocaine and other drugs into the United States through the early decades of the 21st century. Through all of this, Carlos Lehder remained where he had been sent in 1988, within the American federal prison system, serving out the effective entirety of the extraordinary sentence handed down to him, a living relic of the earliest, foundational era of the modern international cocaine trade, a man whose extraordinary rise and equally extraordinary fall had, in certain crucial respects, established the template that so many subsequent traffickers would follow in one form or another, the intoxicating combination of enormous wealth and enormous risk, the seductive but ultimately illusory sense of invincibility that such wealth and power tend to generate in those who accumulate them too quickly and too young, and the near inevitable reckoning that awaits, sooner or later, even the most audacious and innovative architects of criminal empires built, however brilliantly, on a foundation that could never, in the end, escape the fundamental instability and violence inherent to the business itself. What became of Carlos Lehder in the decades following his conviction, how his story finally came to its quiet, almost anticlimactic conclusion, and what lasting legacy the island king of Norman's Cay left behind him in the broader history of the drug trade he helped to create, these questions bring us, finally, to the last chapter of this remarkable and terrible story, the story of a man who built a kingdom out of cocaine, crowned himself its ruler, and watched, in the end, as everything he had built was reduced to nothing but a name in a history book and a cautionary tale told in the shadows. If you're still with me in the shadows, let me know, should we continue to the final part? I'll write the last chapter of Carlos Lehder's story, covering his later years and lasting legacy, whenever you're ready. Some stories end with a bang, a hail of gunfire on a rooftop, a body falling to the pavement, a legend sealed forever at the moment of violent death. Pablo Escobar's story ended that way, in December of 1993, cut down on a Medellin rooftop in a blaze of bullets that turned him instantly into myth. But Carlos Lehder's story does not end that way. His story ends the way so many real lives do, and so few gangster legends are permitted to, slowly, quietly, in hospital rooms and courtrooms and airport holding cells, the outlaw king outliving almost everyone who ever feared him, growing old inside the machinery of the very justice system he once swore he would defy to his last breath. For more than 3 decades, Carlos Lehder simply disappeared from the world's attention, swallowed by the American federal prison system, his name slowly fading from the front pages that had once could not get enough of him. He was held for years under a program reserved for cooperating witnesses, men whose testimony against other, even more dangerous criminals had purchased them a strange kind of protective custody, protection not from the state that had convicted him, but from the very criminal world he had once ruled, a world that does not forgive men who testify against dictators and drug lords, however long ago the testimony was given. Somewhere in the machinery of those anonymous federal facilities, the flamboyant showman who had once thrown cocaine-fueled parties on a private Caribbean island, who had once stood before crowds of Colombian supporters railing against American imperialism, simply ceased to exist as a public figure. He became a number. A file. A name mentioned in passing whenever journalists revisited the history of the Medellin cartel, always in the past tense, as though he were already gone. He was not gone. He was aging, quietly, inside a cell, and the years were not kind to him. At some point during his imprisonment, doctors diagnosed him with prostate cancer, one final, unglamorous irony for a man who had spent his youth convinced of his own invincibility. And then, on June 15, 2020, after more than 33 years in American custody, the sentence that had once been handed down as one of the harshest in the history of American drug prosecutions, life plus 135 years, finally released its grip on him. He walked out of a federal facility in Florida a 70-year-old man, frail, ill, carrying a cancer diagnosis and more than 3 decades of lost time, and boarded a flight not to Colombia, the country of his birth, the country whose politics he had once tried to reshape, but to Germany, the country of his father, a nation he had never once set foot in, but whose citizenship, inherited through blood he'd never had reason to claim before, was now the only passport that offered him anywhere to go. He landed in Berlin with almost nothing. No fortune. No empire. No followers. Just a diagnosis, a lawyer, and a German charity arranging his care because he had no family left in the country that was now, on paper, his home. For 5 years, Carlos Lehder lived quietly in Germany, a ghost of the man who had once ruled Norman's Cay, receiving treatment for his illness, living under conditions his own attorney would later describe with a kind of weary bluntness, a man who had once controlled a fortune worth billions now dependent on charity in a country where he had no relatives, no history, no community, nothing but a surname that had opened the door. It is difficult to imagine a fall more complete, more thorough in its erasure of everything a man once was, than the one Carlos Lehder experienced in those quiet German years, the island king reduced to an elderly cancer patient in a Berlin apartment, largely forgotten by a world that had once trembled at the mention of his name. But the story was not quite finished, and its final chapter carried one last, almost fitting twist. In March of 2025, after nearly 4 decades away, Carlos Lehder boarded a flight from Frankfurt to Bogotá, attempting, at 75 years old, to return to Colombia, to see what remained of a homeland he had not set foot in since the day Colombian police dragged him off a farm outside Medellin in 1987. He landed as an old man hoping, perhaps, to see relatives, to close some private circle before whatever time he had left ran out. Instead, immigration officers detained him the moment he stepped off the plane. Colombia, it turned out, had not entirely forgotten him either, an old warrant, tied to a weapons and drug trafficking conviction from decades earlier, still technically on the books. For 3 days, the man who had once evaded governments, bribed officials, and ruled his own private kingdom sat in Colombian custody while a judge determined his fate one final time. And in a resolution that felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had come before, a Bogotá court ruled that the statute of limitations on his old Colombian conviction had long since expired. There would be no final Colombian prison sentence, no dramatic last act of vengeance from the country whose institutions he had once helped to terrorize. Carlos Lehder walked free, an old man with cancer and an expired warrant, finally, fully, free of every court, every case, every government that had ever hunted him, free in a way that meant almost nothing anymore, because there was no empire left to return to, no island, no fortune, no followers. Just an old man, finally allowed to go home. What, then, do we make of a man like Carlos Lehder, of a life that began in the quiet coffee hills of Quindío and traveled through prison cells and marijuana runs, through a stolen island transformed into a smuggler's fortress, through political rallies and assassinated ministers and a war that left thousands of Colombians dead, through a federal courtroom in Jacksonville and 33 years inside American walls, and finally, improbably, to a quiet, anonymous old age in a country he had never known, ending not with a bullet but with a judge's signature on a piece of paper. Lehder himself, in rare interviews given after his release, seemed to have arrived at something resembling an answer, though whether it came from genuine reflection or simply the exhaustion of a man who had lost everything is impossible to say for certain. He told those who would listen that the life he had built was never worth what it cost, that whatever wealth, whatever power, whatever intoxicating sense of invincibility the cocaine trade had once offered him, it had, in the end, taken everything, his freedom, his health, his family, the best 30 years of his life, and the chance to ever again be simply an ordinary man walking through the world unnoticed. It is tempting, when telling a story like this one, to search for a clean moral, a tidy lesson that explains exactly where a man like Carlos Lehder went wrong and exactly what separates him from the rest of us. But the truth, as it so often is in stories like these, is messier and more unsettling than any clean moral could capture. Lehder was not simply a monster, nor simply a genius, nor simply a revolutionary, nor simply a fool. He was, in the end, a deeply human mixture of all those things, brilliant enough to see an opportunity that transformed an entire hemisphere's criminal economy, reckless enough to believe he could outrun the consequences forever, and ultimately, tragically, ordinary enough to end his life not as a legend cut down in a blaze of glory, but as an old, sick man who outlived his own myth, who had to watch, in the quiet decades of his imprisonment and the quieter years that followed, as the world moved on entirely without him, as new traffickers rose and fell in cities he had never seen, as the very cartel he had helped found became a chapter in history books and a subject for streaming television dramas that turned his own extraordinary, terrible life into entertainment for a generation of viewers who would never know what it had actually cost. The island of Norman's Cay still exists today, its runway long since reclaimed by grass and salt air, its harbor once again home to nothing more dangerous than sailboats and vacationing tourists who, if they know the island's history at all, know it only as a strange footnote, a place where, once, a young man from the coffee hills of Colombia believed he could build himself a kingdom that no government on earth could touch. He was wrong. Every kingdom built on cocaine and fear and blood eventually meets the same fate, whether it ends in a rooftop shootout or a quiet hospital bed, whether the king dies in a blaze of gunfire or simply grows old and forgotten, watching from a rented room as the empire he built crumbles into nothing more than a story told in the dark, a warning whispered to anyone tempted to believe that this time, somehow, the ending might be different. If this story pulled you into the shadows tonight, you know what to do: hit subscribe, so you don't miss the next dark chapter from the underworld of history. And if Carlos Lehder's rise and fall left you wanting more, there are other kingdoms out there, other kings who believed they were untouchable, other stories waiting in the shadows for you to discover. Until next time, stay close to the light, because out there, in the dark corners of history, there's always another story waiting to be told.